I fell in love with this series back in 2016, and because of that, it's hard for me to believe that there was ever a point in time where Song of Ice and Fire novels were actively being published. That said, today, July 12th, 2023, marks 12 years since the publication of the most recent main series book, A Dance with Dragons. It's an incredibly complex text that has changed a lot over its decade in development and has a number of shifting opinions in the fan community today regarding its quality. Today, I'm going to be analyzing this book's publication history, contents, characters, and thematic ideas. There will be positive opinions, there will be negative opinions, and there may even be a special guest. I'd love to hear your opinion on this fairly divisive book in the comments. But with all that being said, I'm going to examine the fifth book in A Song of Ice and Fire. George R. R. Martin's fantasy epic was initially envisioned as a trilogy, broadly similar in format to the Lord of the Rings books. In this early stage of development, the second of three novels was intended to be entitled A Dance with Dragons, preceded by A Game of Thrones, and followed by The Winds of Winter. This changed quite quickly, however. After Martin wrote the first book in the series, he immediately realized that two more books were needed to fill up the holes left by the ending of Game of Thrones and bring that story to a conclusion. After the publication of A Storm of Swords, the third book in the series, the stage seemed to be set for the publication of A Dance with Dragons, a long awaited novel, to be followed by the final act in the series, The Winds of Winter. Unfortunately, Martin's plans would soon change again. His story had grown too broad and his plots too complex. The manuscript for the next novel in the series had grown out of hand, and he had to make the difficult decision to split it in two. Not only that, Martin decided to divide these volumes based on location and characters rather than chronologically. Book 4 would feature a wide variety of characters new and old, yet it held no Jon Snow, Tyrion Lannister, or Daenerys Targaryen chapters. This presented some issues for the overall story structure that I'll discuss a bit later. Ultimately, A Feast for Crows, the fourth book in the series, released in October of 2005, and readers would wait for 6 long years before receiving A Dance with Dragons. But why did Dance in particular take so long to rewrite? George Martin himself has shed a good deal of light on this issue, and he has continually pointed to a single culprit, the Meereenese Knot. This particular turn of phrase is a reference by Martin to the legendary Gordian Knot, a myth stemming from the time of Alexander the Great. The Gordian Knot was said to be impossible to correct, and it was whispered that whoever could untie this great beast of a length of rope would rule all of Asia. Many men tried, and many men failed, until Alexander came along. Instead of taking the time to untie the knot, he simply slashed through it with his sword. Complicated problem, but a simple, elegant solution that no one had thought of. But what does that myth have to do with the Dance with Dragons? Well, by allowing his story to grow out of hand, Martin had written himself into an incredibly complex situation with no clear way that he should proceed, namely the situation surrounding the city of Meereen in Essos. A truly staggering number of people and events were destined to collide with Daenerys Targaryen during her rule of this newly free city, and Martin had to determine what order these things happened and how their consequences would be handled. He's spoken of writing numerous different versions and drafts of this portion of the story, with some characters arriving at different points or not even arriving at all, only to eventually scrap it. Solutions were difficult to come by, and they were made even more so by the point of view character issue. There are so many point of view characters heading to or in Meereen, a maximum of 6 at any one point, it made viewing certain events from certain angles a logistical nightmare to get the pieces into place in order to actually have that happen. These events are best explained by the man himself. To quote from Martin, it was a confluence of many, many factors. Let's start from the offer of Zaro to give Dany ships, a refusal of which leads to Karth's declaration of war. Then there's the marriage of Daenerys to pacify the city. Then there's the arrival of the Yunkish army at the gates of Meereen. There's the order of various people going her way, Tyrion, Quentyn, Victarion, Aegon, Marwyn, etc. Then there's Dario, this dangerous sellsword, and the question of whether Dany really wants him or not. There's the plague, and then there's Drogon's return to Meereen. All of these things were balls that I'd thrown into the air, and they're all linked and chronologically entwined. The return of Drogon to the city was something I explored happening at various times. For example, I wrote 3 different versions of Quentyn's arrival at Meereen, one where he arrived long before Dany's marriage, one where he arrived much later, and one where he arrived just the day before the marriage, which is how it ended up being in the novel. I had to write all 3 versions to be able to compare and see how these different arrival points affected the stories of the other characters, including the story of a character who hasn't actually arrived yet. As the man says, it's quite a complex problem, made even more so by the fact that he wanted to write every single version of events as they could have happened. However, the solution at which Mr. Martin arrived was quite the elegant one, as Alexander did before him, adding one single viewpoint character. That particular character is Sir Barristan Selmy, who served as a pair of eyes on the events of Meereen after Daenerys is flown off to the Dothraki Sea on the back of her dragon Drogon. New point of view characters are an interesting topic in this case. Dance has four on offer, but this wasn't always the author's goal. In the Notablog post in which he announced the novel's completion, Martin mentioned that he only initially intended one of these characters to serve as a viewpoint. This is quite the interesting detail, and it could potentially indicate the future of certain characters' roles in the story. Because, at least to me, it says that of these four characters, Martin's initial version of how the story has to go, the baseline foundation, only includes one of them as a point of view. Specifically, the four new viewpoints are Barristan Selmy, Quentyn Martell of Dorne, Lord John Connington, and the Red Priestess Melisandre. We already know that Sir Barristan was added as a viewpoint to circumvent the Meereenese Knot, and I would bet on Quentyn being a later addition as well. This is primarily due to his death later on in A Dance with Dragons. This leaves us with Mel and Jon Con as our original POV candidates. And of those two, I'm sorry, my beloved Jon Con, but I lean towards Melisandre being the initial intent behind Martin adding a point of view character in Dance. While she does only have one chapter, personally I believe that her being planned from the start of a POV in this book would say a great deal in her involvement at the Wall following Jon's death in A Dance with Dragons, as she will likely have a crucial role to play there, both in his resurrection and in potentially being a viewpoint for events surrounding him if Jon doesn't come back as a point of view, as Lady Stoneheart hasn't either. Speaking of these new characters, they're all utilized really well throughout this book. Quentin's story is an interesting dissection of the archetypical hero's journey, but overall he's my least favorite point of view in A Dance with Dragons. His chapters going through Essos feel as though they overlap both thematically and informationally, with better chapters from Tyrion's or Connington's perspective. And him being killed at the end of the story, while an interesting subversion of tropes, does tend to make his chapters feel like a waste of pages to some degree. Also, everyone keeps saying that he looks like a frog, and because his name is similar to mine, it makes me self conscious that I look like a frog. Overall, good point of view with some rather glaring issues. As for the two other new viewpoints, I've made my feelings on Connington abundantly clear, and I won't discuss him much here. That'd take up the rest of the video. Barristan, on the other hand, I really love his chapters, and it's a fascinating change of pace from anything we've gotten before in the series. He's much older than any other POV character, and because of this, his chapters have quite the different feel to them. There's a lot of memory, and you can feel the weight behind his decisions. His journey launching a coup in Meereen has shades of Cersei due to how politically inept it is. But overall, specifically the Kingbreaker chapter is awesome, and I really, really like his journey later on in Dance. With new characters covered, let's take a look at some of the series' protagonists and their arcs in Dance. I'm going to start with perhaps the most controversial arc in this book, Daenerys in Meereen. Given the fact that this book is named after dragons, I went in on my first read expecting this book to be far more focused on Dany than any of its predecessors were. I was right to a degree, but that focus did not play out as I expected. Daenerys does not make a break for Westeros in order to take over as a queen in this book. Instead, her chapters are spent politicking and keeping the peace in Meereen. As a character choice, it absolutely makes sense. Daenerys wishes to be a queen, and in order to do so, she must first learn how to govern. Where it seems many fans take issue is how this particular plot is executed in A Dance with Dragons. I've often heard the complaint that fans were bored to tears during Dany's stay in Meereen, that nothing happened, and that it was simply a waste of page space. I wholeheartedly disagree with that complaint, and I'm not defending it just to defend it. There's a decent portion of this book that I think should be cut, and I'll get to that later. But Dany's arc in Meereen is a lot like Brienne's arc in A Feast for Crows for me, insofar as they both improved drastically on my rereads of the series. Dany's arc here is a dissection of her as a character and her as a leader, and the compromises she's willing to make in order to maintain order. It's an attempt to find equilibrium between her desire to maintain peace through diplomacy and her Targaryen call towards fire and blood. There's a really great series of essays entitled Untangling the Meereenese Knot that I highly recommend reading after you finish this video. It did really help me appreciate Dany's story more on rereads. That being said, I do think it could be paced a little better, and probably one or two of its overall chapters could be cut. Moving on to the other dragon for which this story was likely named, as he has more chapters than Dany does, Jon Snow's narrative throughout the fifth book in the series is far less controversial. His journey is also a test of leadership, and it parallels Dany's in a wide variety of ways. Having been elected as the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, Jon must navigate the Watch's internal politics as well as the external politics of the Seven Kingdoms and the Wildlings, all the while preparing for the impending conflict with the Army of the Dead. I think the main advantage of Jon's story over Dany's in this case is the pacing. There's a lot going on in the North throughout this entire book, and Jon's at the center of many of the elements at work here. The main portions of this arc early on are carried by Stannis' presence at the Wall, as his assessments and offers to Jon are incredibly interesting. The dynamic is really fun, as Stannis in many ways is similar to Jon's adoptive father Ned Stark. Stannis offers Jon the legacy of the house he always wished was his, intending to grant the bastard Winterfell should he join the one true king's cause. This is again a story about testing boundaries, about temptation, and about the human heart in conflict with itself. Jon remains steadfast in his convictions throughout many of his chapters, and he refuses this offer and remains loyal to the Watch for now. Jon's story effectively has two different endings in this book. Jon 12 acts as a bookend to his quest to allow the wildlings through the Wall, as he welcomes thousands of newcomers to the south in this very uplifting scene. However, this is not Jon's final chapter in A Dance with Dragons. Jon 13 is likely the most infamous chapter in this book. Lord Snow receives a letter supposedly sent by Ramsay Bolton, dubbed the Pink Letter by fans. He announces his intention to ride south and save his sister from the Boltons, and as a result, he is betrayed and killed by his brothers in black. It's an incredibly impactful moment and a tragic end to the arc of leadership we've been seeing unfold throughout this entire book. It's one of the best chapters in the series, in my eyes, and I think it plays out in a really logical way given the events of this story as a whole, as many of his brothers in arms have become discontent with his attitudes towards wildlings and the duties of the Watch as a whole. Welcome back to Quinn's Nitpick Corner. I think Jon 13 should have been the final chapter of Dance, or the second to last behind Dany 10. Why is there a random Barristan chapter between the two of them? It doesn't make sense pacing-wise. It should have been before or earlier. I don't like it. But overall, good chapters, good chapters. Rounding out our trio of what I consider to be main characters, we have Tyrion. This might be a hot take, but Tyrion's arc in A Dance with Dragons is my least favorite by a mile, and I'll explain why. To start, I absolutely adore the first half of his story. Him being adrift in Essos and eventually finding his way through this new land alongside Jon Connington, young Griff, and this ragtag band of heroes is incredibly fun to read and leads to some really fun interactions and dynamics. However, as I said, this is only half of his arc. Tyrion has 12 chapters in Dance. I get that he's Martin's favorite character to write, but I feel like he shouldn't have as many characters as the Dragon Queen in a book called A Dance with Dragons. He's had a ton of chapters in every book in the past. This does not necessarily need to be the same. What's more, most of the material covered in the back half of Tyrion's story in Dance has already been covered, either by earlier parts in his own arc in Dance or by Quentyn Martell's journey to Daenerys. As I'm writing this segment, I'm realizing that I might have been too harsh to Quentyn earlier. I am sorry to my beautiful little frog boy. Anyways, it just bothers me that Tyrion takes up so much page space in this book when there are elements of the story that already had to be completely moved to the next book just for lack of space, which I'll get to in a minute. But before I get to that, a special guest has arrived. The one and only Fantasy Haven is here to talk about what I consider to be the most universally loved portion of A Dance with Dragons. I love it too, and I'm very excited to hear his thoughts. Take it away, man.
Hello, I wanted to talk about my favourite storyline in A Dance with Dragons, the North. Actually no, scratch that would take hours to talk about. So I want to focus specifically on Reek. I still remember reading Dance for the first time and coming across this new character called Reek, a tortured, twisted creature who, I realised with growing horror, was Theon Greyjoy, who had been missing for 2 entire books. That bone-chilling twist was only just the beginning. Through the eyes of this broken madman we return to Winterfell. No longer the beating heart of A Song of Ice and Fire, but a shard of ice infested by ambitious psychopaths and grotesque murderers. When the blizzard unleashes its bitter judgment, and Winterfell becomes an icy cauldron of tension, hatred, murder, fear and mystery, I realised I was reading some of George R.R. Martin's best work. The atmosphere is incredible, the prose and pacing is some of his best, and the character work is second to none. Watching Theon go through this metamorphosis is genuinely inspiring to me as a wannabe writer, and it stands out as one of the best storylines in this flawed but ambitious 5th installment.
Thanks again, Fantasy Haven. Be sure to subscribe to his channel if you haven't already. But before we move on to some final analysis, it's worth discussing some more characters who have fewer chapters in this book. Jaime and Cersei only have 1 and 2 chapters respectively, but they're excellent. Cersei's arc from Feast reaches its conclusion here, as she's forced by the Faith to take a walk of shame. It's a tremendously well written chapter, and we can observe the changes in Cersei's psyche and demeanor as it progresses, ending with the reveal of Robert Strong as her champion in trial by combat in order to give her a little bit of hope, a little light at the end of this terrible tunnel that she has just walked. Also, Jaime's single chapter is incredibly underrated. He's lifting the siege of Raven Tree Hall and dealing with the Blackwoods and the Brackens at their squabbly best. Here we get to see who Jaime has become throughout his journey in Storm and in Feast, as he efficiently treats with both sides and puts an end to the siege quite quickly. It's a very natural progression from lifting the siege of Riverrun in the previous book, and it's great to observe Jaime's growth in a very tangible way. And of course, it ends with Brienne's surprise arrival, undoubtedly luring Jaime into a trap set by the vengeful Lady Stoneheart. And speaking of underrated chapters, the Iron Suitor is the most underrated chapter in this book. Victarion's chapters are all bangers all the time, as is his only other chapter in this book, which is just entitled Victarion. But I specifically love the writing and progression in this one particularly. Victarion starts out frustrated and brooding, unhappy with his mission and with its progress. This tense feeling manifests as an infestation of monkeys aboard his ships. Victarion detests these creatures and repeatedly wishes them expelled from the ship, yet he's powerless to remove them. Building off of this, both Victarion and his maester are powerless to slow the infection in his hand from a wound taken in battle, which will likely take his life in the coming weeks, as a similar infection took Khal Drogo. In the midst of all this turmoil, a savior appears, a soul flame stranded on the sea. Victarion's ship picks up Makoro, a red priest of R'hllor who was set adrift by a previous shipwreck. Makoro states that he has seen Victarion in his flames, and that the Iron Captain has an important role to play in the future. Makoro offers to heal Victarion's hand, and the pair disappear into the captain's quarters. The narration of this chapter soon shifts to a very disconnected, third person view, and all the crew can hear that Victarion's chamber is echoing screams throughout the night. These screams, in the presence of the dark magic that fuels them, causes the monkeys to flee the ships, throwing themselves into the sea rather than bearing witness to what is to come. Victarion soon emerges and slays the maester that he hated, standing on the deck of his ship, his arm healed and strengthened by magical fire. What a rad chapter! I see it as a microcosm of Martin's attitude on Victarion in a meta sense. Victarion starts out as a miserable man, doomed to lose and to die, but thanks to the intervention of this wizard, this fire mage, this Martin stand in, he is granted a magical power and a new lease on life. We know thanks to early drafts of Feast that Victarion was initially planned to die fairly early on. Martin discarded these plans and seems to intend great things for the Iron Captain in the near future. While I'm gushing about individual chapters, I also absolutely love the prologue and the epilogue. The prologue from Varamir Sixskin's perspective is a great way to establish the limitations and ethics of skin changing, as well as setting context for a ward's second life and the role that may play in the resurrection of Jon Snow. The epilogue is a super fun council chapter through the perspective of an interesting character who's been around forever, Kevan Lannister. We get the latest updates on news around the realm before Kevan gets sneak attacked for 1d8 plus 8d6 plus 5 piercing damage by Varys, revealing himself as an Aegon supporter and establishing the young king's cause as very crucial to the future of the series. It's an excellent bookend to an excellent book. Now that we've looked at characters and chapters individually, we can discuss my biggest issue with Dance as a whole, its lack of an ending. A bunch of characters have excellent endings themselves, but the latter half of this book is very clearly building to several battles that we never actually get to see on page. The main point of frustration here is twofold. Firstly, this does seem to be more of a publishing decision than a creative one. Martin's editors wanted him to publish something ASAP, which, fair, but also A Dance with Dragons is already pushing the limits of what can be bound in a normal book. Adding additional battles would almost certainly necessitate two separately bound books, similar to what happened to Storm in Europe. The second point is more of a narrative concern. The plotlines in the north and in the east are very clearly building towards two large-scale battles, one between Stannis and the Boltons, fans have called the Battle of Ice, and a battle in Meereen between the Barristan-led Targaryen forces against the slavers of Yunkai, dubbed the Battle of Fire. Not including these battles essentially resulted in a massive cliffhanger for a total of 5 point of view characters, 6 if Quentyn is alive, which he isn't. This could make portions of the novel feel fairly strange in terms of setup, payoff, momentum, and pacing, as portions of the story have not been paid off 12 years later. Just to note, there are also two more battles coming early on next book: the Battle of Blood, which is Euron versus the Red Wines, and the Battle of Steel, which is Aegon versus the Tyrells. But I think these battles are different. I think they work much better at the start of the next book, the start of these arcs and wins, rather than the end of A Dance with Dragons, where they're not really established quite well. Moving these battles into the next book in the series has likely been one of a million reasons as to why The Winds of Winter is taking so long. Martin tends to do extensive rewriting, and these four battles remaining unpublished for so long is a massive, massive time sink in terms of rewriting, I would imagine. Each could honestly be viewed as its own Meereenese Knot, and I honestly don't envy Martin's task of continuing to write these complex plots that will eventually follow after these battles. Overall, to address this issue, I would personally have cut a few of Tyrion's chapters, maybe one or two of Jon's or Daenerys's as well, and made room for these extra battles in some degree, at the very least paying off some of the setup that they've had over the course of this book and leaving it as a more satisfying narrative experience in its own right as a self-contained novel. That being said, I do very much see where Martin was coming from, as these characters do have very distinct setup journeys in this book that he wouldn't want to mess with, and he probably didn't anticipate a 12-year wait time for the next book in the series. A Dance with Dragons leaves behind a complicated legacy. In my eyes, it's the most hit or miss book in the series. It contains some of the most amazing chapters: the Griffin Reborn, the Prologue and Epilogue, the Iron Suitor, Daenerys 10, Jon 13. But it also has a wide number of chapters that feel meandering or redundant. It's incredibly interesting to see these characters in this point in their arc, as it has turned from what was the second of three books, what likely would have been the climax of the story, to a book that is fairly introspective and examining these characters as people, as leaders, and testing their limits and seeing what they are willing to do to advance what is important to them. Overall, I really like A Dance with Dragons, and I really want to reread it again now that I've talked about it so much in this video. Hopefully, it will not be the most recent A Song of Ice and Fire novel for very much longer, but overall, it's very good, and I'm happy to celebrate its 12th anniversary. Thank you all so much for watching. This video was a beast to put together. Thank you to Fantasy Haven for guesting and doing his segment. And if you enjoyed this, be sure to subscribe both to my channel and to his channel. I'd love to hear your opinion on Dance in the comments. And yeah, be sure to let me know what you thought of this video, of my perspectives, and just general opinions. I'll be back with more content in the near future, and I really appreciate any support on this video, so be sure to like as well. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day. I'll see you soon, like I said.